Before I hand over to Fabio, I just want to say a few things about how we got to today's seminar. It's part of a program we've called Remembering Politics, and it came out of a discussion at SWOP around how we record everything, everywhere. About how we engage with the question of the South African election and reflecting on 30 years of democracy since 1994. So this program comes out of it, and it's had a number of public engagements, one of which you'll see the outcome of at the back in the form of a whole bunch of posters. So we had a silk screening workshop and a conversation about democracy on Saturday. And what you see at the back, we invite you to just engage with it. And it's what people came up with out of that. And we think there's some really wonderful ideas there and some really great visual images today. So we co-hosted that with the Wits School of Arts. Yeah, and it was really around the election, aesthetics, the art of politics, democracy, and it was a really, really great session. And I think the posters surface and resurface a lot of what's animated South African politics over the last 30 years and leading into the electoral season. So please have a look at those. And yeah, if you have anything to say about them, we'll chat afterwards. I don't want to say too much more about what brings us here today, but the election season has been described as lackluster or dull by some commentators, a sort of repetition that we've become very familiar with. But we at SWOP and I myself think that this election comes with a certain measure of uncertainty, anxiety even, about what it holds and what futures it represents, or what possible futures it represents. So there's obviously the practical kind of uncertainties, voting on 3 ballots, the possibility of a national coalition. There's provinces that hang in the balance. There's new parties with old faces, surfacing old questions and old traditions. A possibility, according to the pollsters, of ANC falling below 50%. Opposition parties have outlined doomsday scenarios. There's manifestos that have been launched across the country. And in all of this, we still hear the question, what difference does it make if I vote or not? And I think that really is a question about South Africa's transition 30 years on, and how we can reflect on that moment, on that democratic experiment from 1994, and what political futures and alternatives are available to us. But today is really about putting the South African experience in conversation with others, almost decentering the South African experience of democracy so that we can shape how we think about potentially the next 30 years. This year there'll be 64 countries going to an election. Nearly 50% of the world's population will vote in a national election. It's been called an election supercycle, and I'm sure Fabio will talk about a different supercycle in his presentation a little bit later. Close to home, we have Mozambique, Namibia, and Botswana having their elections too, and they join a long list on the continent. So we thought we'd engage with this kind of election supercycle. We'll engage with comparative politics beyond South Africa, and of course engage with not just electoral politics, but what we see globally playing out, sometimes live streamed to our phones in the form of genocide. Things that remake us, including electoral moments, and surely in some ways will remake the world. So with all of that being said, let's turn to other experiences. And I think Fabio's presentation will be really interesting for us, particularly because part of the Brazilian experience shaped our own post-apartheid political imaginaries in the form of the Lula moment, the much talked about Lula moment here in South Africa. So without taking any more time, let me just introduce Fabio very quickly. Fabio Luis Barbosa dos Santos, the full name, is a professor of Latin American Studies at UniFesp, that's the Federal University of Sao Paulo, and Prolam USP in Sao Paulo. He's a SWOP associate and the author of Power and Impetuosity, a history of South America under progressivism. That's a 2021 book. Fabio is a longtime collaborator with SWOP. He's worked with us on the BRICS Popular Politics Project and is currently in South Africa for a year doing comparative research. Over to you, Fabio.
Thank you. Thank you, Taz. Thank you all for being here. Thanks SWOP for hosting me in South Africa and for giving me this opportunity to discuss Brazilian recent politics with you. I'm must start apologizing for the title, which might be misleading, because at first my intention was to talk about Brazil and draw some comparisons with South Africa, but then I realized this is not doable with the time that I have. So that, but maybe we can do that in the conversation that is to follow. So what I'm gonna do, I'll start outlining in very broad strokes the recent political evolution in Brazil for those who might not be familiar with it, and then I'll propose a framework to look at it. And basically, essentially, the question that I'm gonna be asking is, how do we understand the shift from Lula's and the Workers' Party hegemony to Bolsonaro, and then Bolsonaro back to Lula. So first, as I said, I'm going to outline Brazil's recent political evolution. So Brazil was under dictatorship between 64 and 85. First direct elections were held in 1988, but those were turbulent years, and the elected president ended up impeached just 3 years later. Since then, Brazilian politics have been polarized by two different political parties. The so-called Brazilian Social Democrats, who don't have much of social democracy in practice, and they're known in Brazil as the Tucans. The Tucans elected President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was president on 2 mandates on the 90s, and the PT, the Workers' Party, which has been led by Lula, who is a former trade union leader and became, this important political leader in Brazil since democratization. These two parties, the PT and the Social Democrats, they have disputed the second round in every election until the ascent of Bolsonaro. So they've been the dominant political parties in Brazilian politics since the end of dictatorship. The Tucans led the implementation of the neoliberal agenda, and then as a reaction to that, Lula was first elected in 2002. Then he was re-elected 4 years later. And by the time he left the presidency in 2010, the prestige of the country and the Workers' Party he led was at its peak. As you can see, for example, at this Economist cover from 2009, which portrays, the statue of Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro launching like a rocket, and Brazil takes off caption. At the same time, Obama was praising Lula as the most popular politician on earth. So Lula was able to make his successor in the person of Dilma Rousseff, who was then re-elected in 2014. However, Rousseff did not finish her second term because he was ousted in a very controversial impeachment process led by then Vice President Michel Temer. Then 2 years later, Brazil was again making headlines, but for a very different reason. In 2018, Lula was jailed and prevented from running for the presidency. There's an image missing, it's okay. Then Brazilian elected as a president a former military man, Jair Bolsonaro, who personified the most aggressive traits of both authoritarianism and neoliberalism. In this context, progressive expectations gave way to a reactionary offensive on a scale that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Yet again, 3 years later, Lula was re-elected. He was released from prison and made a spectacular comeback to the presidency in 2022, beating Bolsonaro by a very narrow margin, as you can see. There's some images that are missing. That's a pity. So in this talk, I propose a framework to analyze these recent shifts in Brazilian politics. Again, the shift from Lula to Bolsonaro and then from Bolsonaro to Lula. I will start with talking about the demise of the PT. So far from a conservative backlash to previous social conquests, my analysis focuses on the underlying dynamics of PT politics and the contradictions inherent to it. In other words, I explain the downfall of the PT by itself and by the world it created, and by its movement. So to be more precise, I'll explain it. I will focus on the economic and social logic that this politics, the politics implemented by the PT, were powerless to change. The contradictions of this politics can be summarized in three oxymorons. First is the idea of a regressive progressivism. A regressive progressivism in the sense that commodity export-oriented economics reinforced patterns rooted in the colonial past, even if that was done under a political or progressive political discourse. As you can see here, Brazil is basically a commodity export-oriented country. The second oxymoron would be the idea of an inclusive neoliberalism, which has many facets, but I would just highlight the promotion of social integration through social grants in place of universal rights, aiming to include people in an intrinsically exclusionary social dynamic, which is neoliberalism. So overall, this has reinforced the neoliberal rationale. The third oxymoron is the one that is more maybe tricky to explain, and is the one that I'll focus my analysis on. It is the idea of a containment of crisis that cannot prevent the acceleration of crisis. Or to put it differently, it is containment as accelerating desocialization. I'll now develop this idea, which at first might seem clumsy, but it's key to the framework that I propose. So Lula and other pink-tide governments in South America were elected as a reaction to neoliberalism at the turn of the 20th to the 21st century. However, at a deeper level, conditions they faced were determined by a structural crisis of capital that goes back to the 70s. And I'll not go into details of that. For the sake of my argument, it suffices to say that as a response to that crisis, two pillars of wage citizenship have been eroded on a global level ever since, namely formal labor contracts and social rights underpinned by a welfare state. So as mediations between capital reproduction and social reproduction are eroded in a global scale, desocialization is accelerated. In this context, progressive politics as embodied by the PT should be seen as an attempt to contain these social corrosion trends. Social corrosion trends that are broader than Brazil because they're global, and that predate the PT governments because they go back to the 80s or even to the 70s. And I say contain here because PT governments do not address the causes of these corrosive trends, but they design a broad set of sophisticated social policies aiming to mitigate those effects or to contain them. So this is what I mean by politics of containment. However, what is the problem here? The problem is that the politics of crisis containment in 21st century Latin America implies resorting to practices, devices, and policies that accelerated this very process, that accelerated this very crisis, according to a dynamic that could be described as by this oxymoron, a containment that accelerates. So I argued that despite the intentions and desires of the leaders, the attempt to contain the ongoing desocializing trend does not prevent its acceleration. And why is that? It's because containment implies strengthening the very forces that it intends to contain in the first place. And I'll illustrate this argument with three examples drawing from the first term of Lula in the presidency. So at the eve of Lula's election in 2002, there was a threat of capital flight. In order to avoid that, to avoid capital flight and to avoid then an economic crisis, Lula nominated as head of the central bank a former Bank Boston Ward president, who a person that in that very same election was voted as deputy for the Tucans, for the party that has been PT's arch enemy ever since. So the head of central bank not only embodied financial capital, but his nomination was a sign that market politics would prevail over political loyalties. This banker, his name is Henrique Meirelles, served under Lula for 8 years. But when Rousseff was ousted in 2016, he became the economy minister under Temer's illegitimate government. And then he was widely despised because of the policies he implemented. So my point here is that in an attempt to contain the threat of an economic crisis, This attempt resulted in strengthening a political actor who eventually became key to the acceleration of crisis. A second example is political. During Lula's first term, a bribery scheme scandal was unleashed as the party was paying monthly allowances to ensure the support of members of small political parties so that the government could have majority in the parliament. As a response to that crisis, the PT struck an alliance with the then largest party in the parliament, which is called the Brazilian Democratic Movement. As a result of that alliance, the PT nominated future coup creator Michel Temer twice as vice president in Rousseff's ticket. So again, while in the vice presidency, Temer became a key plotter against Rousseff, who was eventually deposed in 2016. And then Temer filled in the presidency before Bolsonaro was elected 2 years later. So again, to contain a political crisis unleashed by a bribery scandal, key forces in the acceleration of crisis that led to Rousseff's deposition were then strengthened. A third example. Those images would be really important here. Anyway, early in his presidency, Lula sent the Brazilian military to command the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Haiti. This participation was conceived as part of a broader design to make Brazil a global player. However, it is no secret that the military saw Haiti as an opportunity to experiment with violent social management techniques. Back home, many were convinced that the army should engage in similar missions but at the domestic level. At the same time, politicians willing to wield the heavy hand over the country were demanding military involvement in domestic security affairs. And indeed, the military was deployed on a wide array of so-called extraordinary missions, ranging from the pacification of Rio de Janeiro's favelas to replacing state police when they were on strike. They were also handed responsibilities over the 2014 World Cup and the Rio 2016 Olympic Games. These same military men who were empowered in civil affairs by the PT ended up filling top posts in the Bolsonaro government. To give but one example, former Haiti General Azevedo e Silva was later appointed by Rousseff to head the Olympic Public Authority. And this very same general, under Bolsonaro, he became the Ministry of Defense, a ministry that was created in 1999 with the explicit intention of enforcing civilian control over the armed forces. It's a ministry that had never been occupied by the military before. So to sum up the argument so far, it's not a matter of goodwill, but we're facing with a political dynamic that is inherently contradictory. The attempt to contain desocialization fails because it implies strengthening agents of desocialization in itself. So seen through those lenses, the best way to describe the links between the defenestration of the PT and the rise of Bolsonaro is not a 180 degrees shift, such as was the case, for example, when Pinochet deposed Allende in Chile in 1973. But I would say it is a metastasis in the sense that corrosive forces that were never challenged but which seemed to be under control under the PT years, later on spread unchallenged throughout the national fabric. So I'll now move into Bolsonaro, and it's a pity the images are not here to be displayed. If we were to summarize the differences between the PT approach to government and Bolsonaro's, I would say that while the PT has a crisis management approach, Bolsonaro thrives on crisis. He doesn't govern to contain crisis, but he governs through crisis. Some of these crises are real, some of them are manufactured. I don't have the time to go into the details of that, but for the sake of my argument, two ideas should be highlighted. The first is that if the PT attempted to contain the erosion of the social fabric through a set of social policies, Bolsonaro's policies were set to accelerate the erosion of this very same social fabric. His government cut social rights, underfunded public services, lifted social and environmental regulations, among other policies geared to give a green light to accumulation by dispossession. So in short, the acceleration of capital demands accelerated the erosion of the social fabric. But the paradox is that, if brought to its full extent, the acceleration of these corrosive trends becomes counterproductive from the perspective of capital itself, from the perspective of business. As capitalism always requires some level of regulation, some level of checks and balances in order to save capitalism from capitalists, as Keynes once put it. So if the unfolding of the PT government shows that containment of crisis does not avoid its acceleration, Bolsonaro's government suggests that the acceleration of crisis does not preclude its containment. And I'm going to illustrate that with two examples. At the height of the pandemic, that is to say, at the height of a multidimensional crisis, the Congress imposed an emergency social grant. And I want to be clear here, it was imposed by the Congress. So the Congress imposed a social grant that paid 4 times more money to 4 times more family than the Bolsa Familia program, which was the flagship of the Lula years. In hindsight, it became clear that this emergency aid was key to boost Bolsonaro's support despite his criminal management of the pandemic. The duration of the program was extended, and Bolsonaro eventually mocked Lula in the 2022 elections, arguing that if Lula was such a friend of the poor, why did he pay so much less money to so many fewer people? This observation also suggests that Bolsonaro's approach is certainly different to Lula's, but it's not its contrary. So if Lula empowered the military, Bolsonaro also played the social grant card. They are the opposite of each other, but strictly speaking, they are not the contrary of each other, in the sense that there is no contradiction between them or between their approaches. As in that famous British tale, the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the doctor and the monster, it seems that we're facing two sides of the same coin, or to be more precise, two different but not contradictory ways of trying to hold together a society that is dissolving. A second example of how the acceleration of crisis may demand containment is given by Lula's release from prison in itself. He was let out by the same judges that jailed him in the first place. But why has he been released then? There were no new evidences to the case, and there was no significant popular pressure. We must observe that Lula's release took place at a moment when there was no light in the end of the pandemic tunnel, which was then at its peak, while it was clear that Bolsonaro was not going to be impeached. It seems that Lula's acquittance was a move in the upper floors of Brazilian society to bring back to the table a viable alternative to Bolsonaro in the 2022 election. In other words, to bring back the alternative of containment, as opposed to the acceleration of crisis which was embodied by Bolsonaro himself. However, and here I'm wrapping up, this dynamic between containment and acceleration should not be mistaken as a pendulum movement. If a movement there is, it is rather a downward spiral movement, so that the Brazil that Lula faces in 2023 is very different from the one he faced 20 years before. And this is not only because of Temer or Bolsonaro's government, but it is because the ongoing desocializing trend might be contained or accelerated, but it's never stopped or reversed. So the social disembedding that nurtures hate politics worldwide keeps its pace. It seems that unless different politics can be created and put into place, the future of this present belongs to them. I'm sorry not to end in a cheerful note, but this is what I wanted to share with you.
Thanks, Fabio. Our second speaker, who was supposed to join us online, we've had a number of challenges because she's traveling, but we do have a video that we're going to play of her. So if I can ask you to just note down all your questions for Fabio, and we'll get back to those as soon as the video is done playing. So our second input is from Dr. Rama Dieng, who is an academic and scholar activist at the Center of African Studies, University of Edinburgh. and an author. Before the University of Edinburgh, she worked for 5 years in policy research at the African Institute for Economic Development and Planning, United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and before that, the United Nations Development Program in Mauritius. She has also taught at the Department of Development Studies at SOAS. Rama's research focuses on agrarian change, feminist political economy of development, labor care and social reproduction, politics of development in Africa, that's Senegal and Mauritius, and social movements. Rama also serves on the board of the African Studies Association in the UK. So they're going to play the video and then we'll come back to a discussion right after that.
Dear colleague, I hope this finds you well. I'm really sorry I am not able to attend and deliver this talk in person. I was really looking forward to having this conversation with Fabio and Tasneem on comparative politics, looking at Brazil, South Africa and Senegal. Unfortunately, I am traveling for a conference and will not be able to access internet at the time of the workshop. So I am really sorry for that, and I am recording this short video to share some insights that I would have loved to present in person to you. So Senegal has recently had a democratic transition during the March 2024 elections, in which President Bassirou Diomaye Faye was elected, replacing President Macky Sall, who was in power since 2012. But before the elections took place, we faced a very troubled period, a crisis that some have described as democracy dying in Africa, or the country being on the brink of collapsing, as some headlines from the British media would have it. The argument I'm making here is that for Senegal, one needs to understand post-colonial politics, and that this illusion does not hold when one considers the political history of Senegal, which has been described by some as a democratic exception in the troubled Sahelian region. However, what I'm arguing is that there has always been state violence from above and resistance from the citizens from below in Senegal. And that is what holds together the social contract in Senegal. So one needs first to understand that Senegal was independent in 1960 and has experienced 4 long periods of non-military rule. So first we've had Léopold Sédar Senghor as our first president, and he remained in power between 1960 and 1980. After him, we had President Abdou Diouf, who was in power between 1980 and 2000. Abdoulaye Wade took over from him during a much celebrated alternation called SWOP, SWOP meaning change. And for many, this long-standing political opponent to Abdou Diouf accessing to power was a true illustration of democracy working in our country. And after Abdoulaye Wade, we had Macky Sall as a president from 2012 to April 2024. So why am I describing this? Because as you can see, all these 4 presidents were elected, democratically elected, and did not seize the power through military coups. But my argument today is that the elections that we've had in 2024 has to be analyzed through a political economy lens to understand that it is indeed a democratic takeover. It is in fact a democratic takeover that took place, especially after the incumbent president Macky Sall tried to remain in power by seeking to change the constitution and postpone the election dates from March 2024 to December 2024, which was resisted by the Senegalese citizens and which was rejected by our constitutional court. And before this rejection, there has been the decision to postpone the election sparked resistance across the country, protests that have been going on since March 2021, actually, but for different reasons. Citizens resisting state brutality, police through the use of the police as a weapon to silence and punish protesters. So this decision of the Constitutional Court to reject the plan to postpone elections is something that has been saluted by many countries internationally, but also across the African continent. I think this demonstrates that because Senegal has strong institutions in place, this was the reason for citizens' mobilization and resistance to pay off. But I wanted to take a longer durée analysis, not in the sense that historians use it to talk about change in the long term, but just analyzing the post-colonial politics of Senegal to understand that in fact the pre-electoral period has always been a trying time for Senegalese democracy. Analyzing this history of politics and elections since independence allow us also to understand that President Macky Sall's decision to postpone the elections to June or December by mobilizing a parliamentary vote backed by the majority of coalition MPs and the intervention of the police inside the parliament to subdue the protest was undemocratic, and this moment has to be reinscribed into that history of violence, state brutality, to understand that the crisis that we experience in February 2024 is in fact comparable to the crisis that we have had in 1962 when President Léopold Sédar Senghor put to jail his Prime Minister Mamadou Dia because he was suspecting him of planning a military takeover. And this led our country, Senegal, to adopt a presidential regime and making it de facto a hyper-presidentialist political regime. But one needs to understand with a social scientist, Momar Koumba Diop, Senegalese social scientist Momar Koumba Diop, that in reconfiguring forces in the Senegalese society, the ruling elites were not successful in asserting lasting moral and intellectual leadership over the society. And consequently, groups challenging the legitimacy of the ruling class have developed a riot culture. And that's the reason why, when one analyzes the alternation from President Abdou Diouf, for instance, to Abdoulaye Wade has been a long-standing opponent, and his political program called SWOP, meaning changing things, the roots of the structural causes of issues that Senegal was facing resonated within the youth and led to some protests. Similarly, when President Abdou Diouf put to jail Mamadou Dia, he was also faced by citizen and student resistance. So what I'm explaining here is that the institutional crisis, which started on 5th of February 2024 in Senegal, is not unprecedented. It was indeed under President Léopold Sédar Senghor that Senegalese experienced that first major crisis in December 1962, resulting in the arrest and life imprisonment of then Prime Minister Mamadou Diouf. A few days later, on the 19th of December 1962, the Parliament approved President Senghor's decision to merge the functions of Prime Minister and President, thereby confirming President Senghor as the new head of government. This was it was following this internal coup orchestrated by President Senghor that the referendum organized in March 1963 sealed the adoption of the presidential regime that we now know in Senegal. But then, a few years later, in February 1967, the assassination of one MP named Demba Diop in a parking lot in Thiès. Thiès is one of the secondary cities of Senegal, followed by the attempted assassination of President Senghor, led to the arrest and execution of 2 people accused of these acts the same year. And following this, President Senghor was re-elected in 1962, and his government passed an austerity package affecting student welfare programs. So the scholarship that was attributed to students were to be, the amount of the scholarship was shrinked, and leading to prompting strikes, unprecedented strike actions at the Université Cheikh Anta Diop in Senegal. I think these strikes are well documented in the writings of Léo Zeylig, my colleague Léo Zeylig of ROPE, the Review of African Political Economy, but also the writings of Abdoulaye Bathily, who is now a well-known historian, but was at the time a student leader, a major student activist. So the strike, which constituted the twilight hours of revolutionary politics in Senegal, according to political scientist Pascal Bianchini, historian Pascal Bianchini, became generalized when major labor unions joined in, later amplified by peasant organizing, leading to student and workers' arrest and even some death in the country. And it is to address this political and social crisis that the cabinet reshuffle was introduced, and President Senghor declared a state of emergency in May 1968. So one needs to understand that this culture of riots is not something new in Senegal. We have seen the same between March 2021 and 2024, when protests resulted in at least 60, some are talking about 80 uninvestigated deaths, including students, and leading to the closure of the main university sites in Senegal. As was the objective in May 1968, student, workers, and peasant protests, the 2021 to 2024 protests were aimed at fighting the cost of living, expensive cost of living in rural and urban centers in Senegal. But there was with it a denunciation of French imperialism and elites' rule. The fact that the class divide, social differentiation was becoming more and more important. So one also need to understand that before the elections, the president Macky Sall took an act which is trying to postpone the elections. That was a defining moment for the protests in Senegal. Because it catalyzed all resistance from across social groups, whether it is civil society, unions, even the academia. There was a group named Academics for Democracy which was formed, and all of them were trying to protest and reclaim the separation of power which is inscribed in our constitution. Following the resistance of student, civil society, and peasant organizations, the outgoing president, Macky Sall, our past president, Macky Sall, faced the decision of the Constitutional Court to reject and declare unconstitutional that decision to postpone the elections. And following that, President Macky Sall decided to propose a fast-track amnesty bill related to the deadly protests between March and February 2024 that I mentioned earlier, which was validated by the Parliament in March 2024. So that amnesty bill covers all acts that are likely to be classified as criminal or correctional offenses committed between February 2021 and March 2024 in Senegal, but also abroad, relating to demonstrations or having political mobilization. So this opened the door to impunity and is an affront to the victims and survivors of protests and their families, according to both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. But one needs to understand that even that amnesty bill is comparable to a law that was taken in 2005 in 2005 by Abdoulaye Wade, called the Aizan Bill, which was contested by the opposition and the civil society. So that bill sought to grant a complete amnesty for all crimes committed in Senegal and abroad relating to general or local elections or committed with political motivation between January 1983 and December 2004, whether the authors have been judged or not. And this means that the judge that I mentioned earlier, Judge Babacar Seye, who was murdered, is still yet to be elucidated. So that judge, who was assassinated on 15th of May 1993, the day after the results of the legislative elections won by the Senegalese Socialist Party, the PS, results were announced, is still yet to be clarified. So what I mean by describing this longue durée history is that one needs to understand the political configuration of Senegal, the fact that pre-electoral periods have always been a trying time for our democracy. And one needs to ask if, with what is happening in Senegal, has history been repeating itself under different presidents? But one needs also to understand when violence from above happens or takes place, it has always been met by the resistance of the Senegalese citizens. For instance, President Macky Sall, who has been the one making that decision to postpone the elections or yet again having this amnesty bill voted, has came to power through the same means, because he was contesting President Abdoulaye Wade seeking to run for a third term. He became an opponent. And President Sall has been testing the quality of the Senegalese institution, which he had spent 2 terms undermining. The illustration of this is the lack of separation between the executive, the parliament, and the judiciary. The constitutional coup by President Macky Sall reminds many Senegalese of his predecessor Abdoulaye Wade's attempt to change the constitution for a third term in 2018 in Senegal. Despite his promise of SWOP, or structural radical change, which saw him elected in 2000 in a tide of popular support, but led to extreme confrontations between citizens and the police within and outside the parliament in 2012, especially on the historic date of 23rd of June 2011. So what we have seen in February and March 2024 in Senegal is not unprecedented. And again, this is yet another illustration of the centrality of pre-electoral periods in Senegal and in many Sahelian countries for redefining the social contract, for redefining the relationship between citizens and their leaders, between elected leaders and also the strength, testing the strength of our institutions. So what we have seen is that there has been much fear in the country, but the decision of the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Council, to overturn President Macky Sall's decision was met with joy and celebrations from most Senegalese citizens in Senegal and in the diaspora. And even if you remember, there was a rallying hashtag called Free Senegal that people used to mobilize and protest. So Free Senegal right now is synonymous with that fight for more social justice, for more equity, and for the respect of the social contract. And what we have seen is that citizens in Senegal have always mobilized against democratic backsliding, and that's why I am talking about a democratic takeover. It is because citizens, the series of protests that we have seen, the police brutality that we have seen, have led to an acute political consciousness from citizens and political mobilization from citizens, whether we are talking about civil society organizations, unions, but also even universities and academics have also exemplified and embodied that spirit of resistance, citizen resistance. One analysis that we can make with historian Mamadou Diouf is that the 20th and the 2012 political elections were marked by the same seal, which is the rejection of the political and economic status quo and the lack of accountability from the ruling elites. So Senegalese citizens have decided that it was neither acceptable it was not acceptable for the country to go back and to slide into crisis in a region which is facing political instability, whether we are talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and their decisions to leave the regional economic community, ECOWAS, and to form the alliance of the Sahelian states. We have seen Senegalese citizens being politically educated and having that desire to establish more equitable and mutually beneficial relations with their elected political leaders on the one hand, and on the other hand, reclaiming more equitable relations between them and global North countries, which has often been described as an anti-French or anti-Europe sentiment. But to me, this is just a call for that new international order to be established. So for me, with regard to the social contract, Senegalese citizens have mobilized restlessly in defense of the constitutional and republican order against state violence. And whether we are talking about the murderous repression of the defense and security forces, the riot police in Dakar, Ziguinchor, and other towns, or the arbitrations, the arbitrary detention and unlawful torture that some protesters have faced, the murder of some protesters, and the injuries that some protesters have faced, Senegalese citizens have mobilized. And in my view, one needs to understand that political economy of democratic takeover, and in which citizens have played a central role in order to understand what we have witnessed in Senegal in 2024. So at odds with voices presenting Senegal as a country on the brink just before that final resolution of the conflict, or describing what we have seen in February 2024 as an unprecedented crisis for that Senegalese exception in the troubled Sahelian region, I argue that such a narrative does not hold when one considered Senegal's political history, stained by this social contract made of resistance, the quality of our institutions. There is the strong belief that with the resiliency of our institutions and with adequate, in-depth institutional reforms, such as the rethinking of the hyper-presidential regime in Senegal, which lacks clear separation of powers, the country can only emerge stronger. What we have seen with the election of President Bassirou Diomaye Faye and his Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko is that there is a redefinition of the relationships, the division of power at the top of the state. So President Bassirou Diomaye Faye sharing power with his Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko is seen by many as a power sharing system that can prevent some abuses of power as we have seen in the past. But will this last? Will they maintain the status quo and sharing this spirit of camaraderie and ruling together in a peaceful way? Only the future can tell. But what I do know now is that Senegalese citizens understand that what is at stake is that heritage. Hence, their weighing in redefining the social contract, especially in the run-up to presidential elections. Thank you so much, and sorry for being that long.
Okay, thanks, Fabio. I'm going to invite you back up here. And there's still some drinks, so please help yourselves while we're having the conversation. And yeah, let me just open up. Are there any questions, comments? I'll wait. It's usually crickets for a few minutes, and then and then things will get started after that.
Thanks, first of all, Fabio, for a very interesting talk. There's two questions or two questions that I have. Excuse me, I want to put on the table. The first is your description of that history and the containment and acceleration and the back and forth. What you didn't mention, which I would be interested in hearing, is outside of the electoral process, was how did the majority of people respond to the containment politics of Lula? In other words, it was very difficult for many of us outside of Brazil. You know, there tends to be, just like there is in many cases where there was in this country in the 90s and early 2000s, people who supported the anti-apartheid movement, who supported the ANC, did so quite uncritically. And they did not realize what was going on inside the country, that the ANC was implementing neoliberal policies right from the beginning and was beginning to crush dissent and everything. And they continued to support and see the ANC as this anti-imperialist left force. And I think somewhat similar from what you're arguing is could be described in Brazil. So in that sense, how did ordinary people and workers and the poor actually respond to Lula's, outside of the electoral process, because we know that elections are not really the bellwether of oftentimes of the majority, as opposed to of a democratic process. And the second thing is that's the one practical question. The other one's more of a theoretical or maybe conceptual one about your argument in terms of containment and acceleration. Is this not, or could we not sort of put this within a historical context going all the way back to the big debates in the early 20th century in Europe about revolution versus reform that were happening in Germany, that were happening in Austria and Hungary and all the other rest, that were animated by the debates between Luxembourg and Lenin and all sorts of other things, which is about, here's the question. What does the revolution look like in this context? What does a non-containment policy look like? Because here in South Africa, people talk a lot about revolution, about, we need a revolution, we need this, but very few people talk about what that looks like, other than nationalize everything, according to the EFF, for example. which it can go in the right-wing direction, as we know, in many cases. So, in that context, while you're conceptually describing something very interesting, what's the other side of that? What would have it have taken for Lula to begin to truly radically change the situation, not adopt a policy of containment? I think this would apply to many governments that consider themselves left and speak of very left politics and speak of quite an anti-imperialist politics, but end up implementing neoliberal, anti-poor, anti-working class policies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fabio. And I'm sorry we can't engage around Senegal too much, but it would have been nice to make some links. But I'm sorry if I'm not going to formulate this properly, because these are also just thoughts I'm running through as I've heard you. But Lula, for some of us, marked a point of contestation around neoliberalism and the formation of the first World Social Forum, for example. And I was at the World Social Forum in 2003, where it was Lula, 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 and some of us were relating that back to our Mandela, 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 but in a moment where we were starting to critique and try to make sense of what we were not able to attain under Mandela regime. And for many of us, that World Social Forum allowed us, in the space of the alter globalization movement, to link up with movements, with people who were not thinking along the lines of a nation state, but were thinking possibilities beyond that. And that space became one of creation of something else outside of the nation state, outside of the vote. But at the same time, it was Lula and the PT, the Workers' Party. And you mentioned the decline of work, waged forms of work, and some of the responses to that. And I think interestingly, you point out the kind of differences between Bolsonaro and Lula in terms of welfare and what became the answer in Brazil to the decline of wage labor. But you seem to, and this is what I'm trying to get my head around, because I think we're thinking about it here too, is what has that meant for politics? To have a workers' party or to have a strong trade union movement, part of a liberation struggle, that then gets folded back on the idea of a nation, and a nation in the context of neoliberalization. And I'm asking that also because I think we've deliberately pulled this set of events together, and a very big thanks to Taz for the conceptualization that went behind these three events that we've put under the theme Remembering Politics. I'm going to stop just now, but I want to relate it to one last thing, because in that idea of remembering politics is also one of time and working against history and working against a kind of linear notion of progress. And both speakers tonight had different ways of thinking about time. So a future that's made and thought from the present, or a future that tells us what could be or what could have been. And I think also in the context of the Palestine struggle now, we've had in other sessions people asking us to think about possibilities or the need for another language. So I guess, you know, in all of these alter globalization struggles, we've had the kind of folding back in the end onto the idea of a nation state. Progressive leaders coming into power across Latin America, you know, holding the promise of something else, and that failing, Lula himself included. So in the moment of Palestine, there's also, again, an opening up for the possibility of thinking, I think, against nation, and outside of the kind of conceptualization of politics that's defined by elections and so on. So I don't know if I'm asking a question, but I think I'm putting out a few things that I think I would like us to think together and across different experiences, if you could speak to some of those. Thanks.
Sure, we'll take this and then we'll take another round.
Thanks. Taz, I hope you will forgive me here, but I'm sure Fabio might appreciate to have some of the pressure taken off himself. I would be interested just to hear, as someone who is moderating these kind of two inputs, if you have any thoughts about what either or both of them either might suggest to us about our election or questions that they raise about this particular election that we're about to have. Thanks. That's it.
Sure, back to Fabio.
Okay, thank you so much. Regarding, it was a pity that I couldn't display the images because many of them were trying to bring the sense of the contestation on the streets. So there were a few of the images showing, for example, how um, um, uh, right-wing demonstrations took the streets throughout the years, and so political initiative in that sense has shifted to the right, which is something pretty new. And this is one of the arguments of people that make resemblances to fascism, for example. But so there's one clarification that I want to make to start with. Like, I'm not. My intention is not to criticize Lula or the Workers' Party. It's just try to understand the limits, or like the strengths, but also the limits of this politics. Like, I didn't go into detail about the political, the social policies that they actually developed, which were actually very good, and they have been exported worldwide. But again, they were aiming to mitigating, the effects of desocialization at large, of the jobless growth, or when there is any growth. So, so in I would not criticize Lula for things that he never proposed to. Like, he was never the horizon of the Workers' Party or of Lula, let's say, to revolutionize Brazilian society or to do anything much different than what they did. So the problem then begins if we think that this is where left politics stands. So if this is and because then we are kind of in a sort of a end of the history discourse. But okay, so just to make it clear that I'm just trying to understand, analyze. I'm not criticizing in the sense of, and of course it's much better. So if I didn't end in a cheerful note, the fact that we're being governed by Lula now and not Bolsonaro is in itself something to celebrate. But I see that as rather as a truce, because the mobilization, like this is what I've tried to, the social trends that produce this politicization of social resentment are there. So this will come back. This is for sure. I mean, it's not going to come back. It's just that it's never left. So some of the images were demonstrations that happened like 2 months ago in Brazil, where you see millions of Bolsonaro supporters, while he's at the brink of being brought to trial. So even if Bolsonaro might not be the person, but this politics, and I'm not speaking only because of what I see in Brazil, but what I see elsewhere, particularly in Latin American contexts. So that being said, how this the streets behave it. So I think it's important to backtrack a little bit and talk a little more about how did Lula build such a successful consensus around his governance. So I've called that as a sort of a Lulista mode of regulation of social conflict, which was basically the articulation of, let's say, business as usual. So finance, making money, agribusiness, minerals, But that articulated with social grants, a slight raise of minimum wage, which was connected to the growth of the economy, and this sort of articulation, it was a sort of a win-win situation, which worked very well during the commodity super cycle years. You have to remember that the Lula governments were with, when China was booming, and so Brazil's economy was growing early in the 21st century. So there was money to do those policies, so everybody could win. But there was a shift, and the shift in South America and in Brazil didn't come in 2008. It came a little bit later, 4 or 5 years later. And then there was a convergence of three facts, which in my understanding sort of took the ground of this Lulista mode of regulation of social conflict. So the first was economic crisis in itself. So from 2014, last semester of 2013 already, there was economic crisis which turned into recession. So 2014, 15, and 16 were recession years. And those were the last years of the PTE in government. Second factor were corruption scandals that broke up and were portrayed by, as spectacles by the media, and which were just trashing the PT. And the third factor was a June 2013 revolt, which was the most massive popular protest in Brazilian history. It was in June 2013, which caught the government. It wasn't a protest against the government. It all started as a protest against the hike of transport fares. But then as police repressed it, it all escalated, and we must remember that that was the context when the World Cup was the stadiums for the World Cup was being built in Brazil, and perhaps something similar happened in South Africa, and people were seeing, those massive monies going to those equipments, and then there was no money for healthcare, for education, and people were saying, so you're building these FIFA standards, so we want FIFA standard in healthcare, we want FIFA standard in education. So all that built up, and it was exactly, because it happened in South Africa as well, because 1 year before the World Cup takes place, they play a sort of a practice tournament just before, and that was taking place in Brazil at that moment. So it all converged, so there was this incredible rebellion that lasted 4 days, and for weeks, I mean, and then and the PT was caught in its back foot, like really didn't know how to deal with that, and there's been many interpretations of that, but what I want to highlight here is that even if those demonstrations were not against the PT, didn't have the PT as a target, it was obviously expressing a sort of a discomfort with what the PT years had meant, because by then the PT had been in power for more than 10 years. So I think that the convergence of this social, economical, and political ingredients have produced a shift in the dominant class approach to the management of Brazilian social contradictions. So which can be, let's say, from a sort of a conciliatory approach, which was Lula's approach, to a sort of a more confrontational approach. So this was the backdrop of the downfall of the PT, and then which at first was not the rise of Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro's rise was much later, but it was connected to that. With hindsight, in hindsight, we also see that this was not only the PT government in itself and this Lula mode of regulation of social conflict, which was brought into question, but the framework of what we called in Brazil the New Republic, which is the years, the constitution, the institutionality that followed the end of dictatorship in Brazil. So, and this is similar to what happens in other places where you have this radical right emerging. So it's the whole framework, the whole political framework, which is called into question. So it's interesting, for example, to see that in these elections, when Lula was elected, his vice president now was his former opponent in a presidential election. It's a man that's the leader of the Tucans. So the Tucans and the PT came together in an attempt to try to defeat Bolsonaro now. So it's like the Democrats and the Republicans were together, So this is just because they're saying the Tucans also realize that although they supported the impeachment, but then they open a sort of Pandora box, and it's all of a sudden it's the New Republic that is going astray, and they're losing their feet in themselves as well. They just became a very relevant political party at this point. So that politics are being very polarized between two sort of superhero figures, which are Lula and Bolsonaro. So this is also a very depoliticizing political environment. So, but then after 2013, in any event, the streets were taken by first by demonstrations against Dilma, against Rousseff, and then for demonstrations, so there's people that make connections between 2013 and the rise of this new right, which I don't think it's the case. I'm not going to go into details in that, but the social composition of demonstrators are very different. So it has nothing to do. But in any case, it did open, expose it that Lula had lost, or this Lulista mode of regulation of social conflict had lost its bearings. And so it opened, and what was there to replace? There was nothing coming from the left, but the right had new ideas. And I think this speaks to maybe what Prashani was saying, or even to your second question, which, so when you talk about reform and revolution, the sad news, at least looking from a Latin American point of view, is that revolution now is in the right-wing agenda, not in the left-wing agenda anymore. So when Lula was facing Bolsonaro in these last elections, people were saying there was the PT campaign was playing a lot on the panic of a coup d'état, of a putsch, if in the case that Lula won. And at some point I would say, listen, this never happened in Latin American history, because but as a coup d'état against the U.S., against the United States, never happened in U.S. in Latin American history, and the U.S. was clearly supporting Lula in the election. I'll come back to that. Not clearly. They were not stating that openly, but they were making many statements saying that the result of the elections had to be respected. And obviously, the only one that were challenging the results of the election was Bolsonaro. So I would say, this never happened. A coup against the U.S. never happened, or it did happen, but when it happened, it had a different name. It was called a revolution. But actually, this was the case. Like, now we know that they were plotting a coup d'etat, and it failed. And I had images of that as well. In January, I think if the news reached you that in January 2023, just 1 week after Lula was sworn in the presidency, they stormed Bolsonaro's mobs, stormed in Brasilia, which is Brazil's capital, just in the way that they did in the U.S. capital 2 years before. And now investigations show that there was a plot, a coup that was plotted there, which failed at that moment. But anyway, so this is part of the, and it is also very clear that this far right has a political imagination to offer. It might be apocalyptical, it might be delirious, it might be whatever you think. It has strong religious undertones, strong apocalyptical undertones, but it has been capturing people's imaginations somewhere. And on the other hand, progressive politics, as embodied by the PT, they look back to the past. Like what they promise is a sort of, let's go back to the golden years, or let's offer people jobs. And I'm not against people having jobs, of course, but we must face that that this is not the reality anymore. The way that society is working is so, and Bolsonaro speaks to that. So I'll give you one more example. Like during the pandemic, Bolsonaro was challenging, social isolation, and challenging, let's say, the scientific wisdom behind, how to behave in that context. And a lot of people thought that that was just crazy and irresponsible, and it was irresponsible indeed, but there was a political logic behind it, because he was speaking to those people who could not stay at home. They had to go out and work. So when he said we cannot, when he was going against social isolation and say you cannot prevent people from walking out of their homes to work, he was speaking to that. So it was not only that he had so there was some, let's say, some sense behind the madness. And likewise, he's I would say that this neoliberal sociability brings everybody against each other. It's a sort of, everybody against it. So I would call it autophagic sociability. And then what Lula promises to contain this autophagy, which I'm very much for. Of course, we have to mitigate. Bolsonaro does not do that. He speaks, his discourse is, this is how life how life is. It's everybody against each other. So let's arm ourselves, because this is the best way we can defend ourselves. So we're gonna defend ourselves attacking. So, and join the strong. It's basically it's that logic. So this is part of why I think that the trend of history favors this kind of politics, because he's speaking, he's blowing into that wind. As while left politics is as it stands, it's promising, a sort of a comeback to a golden age that is not there anymore. So we have to reinvent left politics, and maybe starting with labor. Like, for example, maybe a good sign is that. So that's why I like it, Simon, so much. The poster that you did back there, because you say, it's something like no. How do you? How is it? No work, no work, no laziness, something else. So we have the potential, let's say, as a society, at least I'm talking, theoretically speaking, we have the potential of everybody working much less than we do because of the development of productive forces, so to speak. But still, because, we are under the capital's rationale, what happens is that we have a lot of people who have no job, so they fight against each other for the little job they have. But under a different social arrangement, everybody could work much less. So maybe it's time for a shift of paradigm. Instead of giving people jobs, why isn't it possible to imagine ways of reorganizing social production in ways that people can do something else, which is not work and not laziness? Yeah. So, but this has to be invented. And then just speaking a little bit to what you mentioned about state politics, Prishani. I think this is also another challenge that has to be invented, because from my personal perspective, it's I see that state as an institution is it doesn't build, let's say, emancipation. But then how do we organize social relations in large, or production, for example, in large scale without the state? So this is part of, I think, the political challenges that we have. And I think the imagining, and I'm not thinking about imagining in the way that people dream, for example, but a political imagination in the sense of proposing bold and radical, different ways of organizing, production, of organizing. And this has been done many places in South America, but at a small scale, and usually associated with territory. So that one way that we in Latin America have been looking for inspiration or for imagination has been, for example, to indigenous communities or to, other, in the sense, and I'll put it that very simply, and then I'll stop, because we are 400 years old in Brazil. I mean, as being in touch with capital forces and colonialism and so forth. So, and the indigenous people was always seen as as sort of backward. I think this is pretty much the case here in Africa as well. So, but now we realize that the planet is under threat, ecological threat, and so it's becoming a matter of survival. And then who are the most skillful survivors in our continent? They're the indigenous people who have survived all kinds of, of violences in this 400 years of history. So there's a sense there's a lot to be learned there. And of course, that also supposes to start with a paradigm shift away from progress, the idea of progress, yeah? And so, but I'm into that challenge myself, like looking for. I have a Leninist background. I was raised as a Marxist, and I still have, like, I'll always be on time, yeah? But, we have to reinvent, and I'm engaging with that, but looking for answers. So.
I think let me ask if there are any other hands or if we should just, okay. And then I'll come back and see if I can say anything to Lindy.
Thank you so much, Fabio. I think I've been looking forward to your presentation, and I'm hoping that maybe we will have it with the international relations students also. I remember we were talking in terms of like having these comparatives and all of that. And I like how you're speaking into the reinvention of left politics. I think that's happening right now. I think in South Africa it's so contested because the labor, which is where you're situated right now, is very contested. I think labor has always belonged to the mass, the mass politics and all of that. And that reinvention will have to shift that entire thing. But we're also seeing climate politics also as central to the reinvention of left politics. Because I think here in South Africa, climate politics, I think, brings an interesting intersectionality of race, gender, and class, where you can see climate politics through that lens. Something that in the West or in the North, climate politics is always speaking into mitigation or adaptation, which is something totally different here. But if I were to ask a question, I think I'll also put you on the spot because I think you've been here for like a few months now to hear your observations, especially in relation to the Lula way, from presidency to prison back to presidency. I think we have our own Lula hopeful. from presidency to prison and hoping to go back to presidency. And I'd like to hear your observations in terms of how do you think this can unfold here, and of course based on the electoral processes that you have back in Brazil and the ones that we have here, but also the socialist movement. I think you have a stronger socialist movement back in Brazil compared to here, and how that can work in reflecting on our own Lula. Thank you.
Yeah, Fabio, it's such a pleasure to listen to you when you speak about Brazil and these big transformations. I agree with your idea that progressivism progressivism is fading away, probably for a long time now. And this has to be reinvented. But the contradiction is that just at the moment it was going down, this is when Lula and the PT has been able to come on power, and they've been super successful. 4 elections in a row, it's been fantastic. And they bumped into a wall, the wall of their own contradictions. I agree with you, and they are the same as in many other countries, including probably South Africa. Cash transfers. They were believing into the fact that you can buy everything on the market, including for the poor. And I agree with you. There were some room of maneuver compared to the ultra-liberalism that has been hegemonic during the 90s. And now the left and those who want emancipation for the big numbers have to think about how to renew their own collective project. And probably it means that some institutions have to change, and that maybe you cannot buy everything on the market. And meanwhile, it's true that we also have to acknowledge that those regressive policies have a massive support. They are not anti-democratic. They have a democratic support. And it's part of the challenge, I think. The left, as we used to call it, I believe less and less into this term, but let's call it that way, has to be able to speak to these people who are supporting Bolsonaro.
We've got one online, so Neil, you can go ahead and talk.
Thanks for the very, very interesting input. I am from the South African trade union movement historically, and now's not the time, but at another point maybe we should talk about what the Lula moment was in South Africa, because I think it's been very misunderstood as to what we were talking about in 2012 when we coined that particular phrase. But I don't want to waste valuable time talking about that. I think I'd be interested to hear in particular about the regional and the regional potential, both in Latin America and in the global South, for the emergence of a progressive anti-imperialism. You've got the situation in Latin America of this second pink tide, whatever you want to call it. You've got Colombia, Brazil, Chile to a lesser extent, and a couple of other progressive movements. Historically there was the movement towards regional integration, coordination of positions in the region. Dale spoke about posturing behind the anti-imperialism of for example, the BRICS. But I don't think that therefore means that a progressive anti-imperialism is not possible, as I think the ideological hegemony of the global North is fragmenting at a rapid pace. There seems to be an opening for the emergence of progressive platforms between Latin American forces and others in the global South. So I'd just be interested to hear what you think of that. Are forces like the Sao Paulo Forum, the left forces in Latin America, thinking about this, or are they too introspective in terms of trying to defend their position, given the sort of enormous stresses on the movements in the region? Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Fabio, I'm going to try limit you to just 10 minutes for your responses. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, Neil, for your input. Sorry for being long in my previous response. It's just that first thing, I think that there is the fact that the right has been able to mobilize people with a very radical rhetoric and agenda shows that there is potential for radical politics, which goes against, the, let's say, the common sense of the common wisdom of accepted wisdom of left progressive politics. Regarding imperialism, and I think here I speak a little bit to what Neil was saying, this is very tricky because it also depends to who is in charge in the United States. Because I don't have the time to go into detail in that, but at this moment, those progressive governments are often the best, the most reliable allies of US in the continent. This is very easy to see in Central America, which is, I can't go into the details here, but as I just said before, they were very clearly supporting Lula's election. So when you look at Central America, for example, in the past, the US concern with Central America was because of markets and revolution. Nowadays, it's basically because of migration and drugs. And in order to contain migration and drugs, this kind of approach, this progressive government approach with social policies is favored, as opposed to a guy like Bukele, who's in El Salvador, who's the president in El Salvador now, who's campaigning for Trump, for example. So, so the way we have to think about imperialism is quite different in the current context. And then you can argue, well, that there's not a good relationship with Bolivia and Venezuela, but then I would say things get tricky there because we don't have the time to go into detail on that, but Venezuela became a very controversial country, democratic-wise, since they lost their political or the public support in 2015. So I'm not saying that obviously I'm supporting a coup in Venezuela or anything like that. What I'm just saying is that it's difficult to say to support those governments on a sort of a left-wing agenda. And if you look to Nicaragua, where Daniel Ortega is, who is actually supporting, for example, Palestine openly, this is a horrible place. This is the only place where, for example, I was not allowed to go in. And I don't need a visa to go in Nicaragua, but I wasn't allowed in twice. I tried. So anyway, but Nicaraguans are facing much more worse things than I, of course. So it's and then if you look to other countries like Chile and Colombia, which are portrayed as as the greatest hopes in South America at this point, it's very important to see that these are precisely the countries that were not part of the first pink tide, so to speak. So my argument there would be that the alternatives, the political, let's say the ordinary political alternatives were depleted to a point in those countries that now they have a second pink tide. It's also interesting to notice, as Dale knows, that the only countries where there were revolts, rebellions during the pandemic in South America were precisely the countries that have not been governed by by progressive governments before. And these are the countries who actually now have progressive presidents. But it would be very interesting. It's a pity I don't have the time, but still, the window is closing. So that, for example, if you look at Chile, Lula had waited 13 years for a Bolsonaro to rise. Boric in Chile, he faced Chile's Bolsonaro in his first elections in the second round. He almost lost to him. And the far right in Chile is very poison to win the next elections. So what I'm saying, this is what I mean when I said before that this is not a sort of a pendulum, but it is a sort of a downward spiral, so that progressivism in Chile doesn't have the same conditions to develop and to actually build an hegemony as Brazil had, or as Bolivia, or as Venezuela. Yeah. About regional integration, I think it's not going forward. And there were many problems in the regional integration project before, which from the Brazilian standpoint was basically the idea of building, Brazilian hegemony in South America in order to make Brazil a global player. So it was the other side of the Haiti strategy, and this was very much about fostering the internationalization of Brazilian-based corporations such as Vale, which is here in Africa as well, Petrobras, big mining, oil, and construction corporations. In order to build an economic base to project Brazilian as the leader. So the regional integration under the PT years was never about building a team, but it was about making Brazil a regional leader. I think this is pretty much what I... Oh yeah, the difficult one about South Africa. So very quickly speaking, I think that the EFF showcases the lack of left political imagination. Yeah, so look into the past, not only in their agenda, but also in their outline, the way they behave themselves. And I must say that this is not only happening in South Africa, this is happening in Brazil, this is happening elsewhere. So you have sort of, I'm going to use a word here, I don't know EFF as deeply as that, but sort of Stalinist outlook organizations that are rising elsewhere. So as if if we could have our own brand of hierarchical politics would be the best approach to confront the right-wing authoritarianism. As regarding Zuma, that I find it very interesting, interesting in the bad way, that he is trying. It appears that he is trying to portray himself as an outsider, and with this political discourse where he victimizes himself, which is the staple discourse of this right-wing people. And then also, appealing to violent rhetoric, and but still, there are two things that I think that set South Africa in a sort of a special condition regarding this global trend of right-wing politics. The first one is the fact that it's very difficult for Zuma to really sell that he's an outsider. And in all those cases, that that this radical right has been, it is always against the political framework that followed the end of the Cold War. But then, so in South Africa would be going against the ANC and the framework of the ANC. But then I think he's pretty much identical. So there's a limit to that. And the second thing is that the fact that the election here, you don't actually vote to a president, that it also limits, I think, how far, let's say, populist politics can be played out. But this would be very basic comments. But the question that I asked myself, but I told you that already when I first, looking from a broader perspective, I've been participating in a group with people from Turkey, India, Hungary, and the Philippines. So all the bad guys, Duterte, Modi, Erdogan, all the bad guys. And so then we were looking at how that works, how do they build their hegemony, and the fact that the only one that has actually been lost the grip on power was Bolsonaro, gives me the feeling, the sense of how extraordinary was Lula's comeback. Because once these guys are in power, they don't leave power anymore. This radical right is building its power. So often the question that I ask myself, since South Africa is very much exposed to this very same, desocializing trends, the question that I ask myself, what's going to be the face of this radical politics here in South Africa? And that doesn't necessarily has to be a face in the sense of being a person, but might be, for example, the ANC shifting more and more to the right, for example. But the fact is that in the absence of an alternative, or an imaginative alternative streaming, from the left, this is the winds of history are blowing to the sails of the right-wing politics, and I don't know what is the face that is going to have in South Africa, but